Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would kindly like to welcome you to the latest issue launch of Hungarian Conservative. My name is István Kiss. I'm the Executive Director of the Danube Institute, but perhaps more importantly for this event, I'm also the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Hungarian Conservative journal. I would at first like to welcome our distinguished speakers of today. First, Mariann, who is a journalist and head of the foreign desk at the Hungarian Conservative daily newspaper called Magyar Hírlap. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Miklós Szánthó, who is a lawyer and a policy analyst and the director of the Hungarian think tank called Center for Fundamental Rights. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Dreher, who is an American journalist, author, writer of 5 books, 2 of them New York Times bestsellers, and who is also a senior editor at the American Conservative journal, and who is now a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute. And last but not least, Dr. Calum Nicholson, who is an academic, currently teaching at Cambridge University. His area of expertise is climate migration, but also the history and origins of social media. And he is also a visiting fellow now at the Danube Institute, jointly with the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. So thank you all for being here. Our topic today is going to be social media, the censorship on social media, and also to some extent digital sovereignty. First, I would like to start with a question which relates to kind of like the origins of social media, or how we perceive social media for a long time. I think even like a decade ago, we thought that social media is going to be a force for democratization. There were big hopes that because the costs of appearing on social media and the barriers of appearing on social media are much less than on traditional media, social media could be something used for good, basically. This was especially true for the Arabic Spring, when everybody is really hopeful that there's going to be meaningful change in the Middle East because of social media. But it seems that a lot of people changed their minds since. Of course, the Arabic Spring was not successful, and we can see in a lot of states that actually dictatorships can effectively regulate or even ban social media. So I would like to ask you that how do you see, what is your opinion? Can social media be a tool for democracy? Can it be something which is still beneficial or not? Perhaps I would start with Rod, and then the other people can chip in.
Well, I mean, it's social media, like the standard media, can be used for both bad and good. As we're talking now, there might be a revolution underway in Cuba. One of the reasons the anti-government protests are being made widely known in Cuba is because of social media. And I think this is a good thing, that people get to see what's happening on the ground there in Cuba. But I'm afraid that I tend to focus more these days on the negative aspects of social media, because I see what it's doing to children. I have 3 kids of my own. It has been a constant struggle with my kids to both protect them from the things they get on social media, but also train them to regulate themselves, because they're not going to be children forever. Just recently, I was in Slovenia, and I spoke to a father who told me that he and his wife are struggling greatly with their 11-year-old daughter. He said that she encountered via social media 2 people, I guess other teenagers or young people, in the west coast of the US, and they told her, you have to decide your gender identity before your body decides for you. And so they planted this idea in the head of this child, and the man told me, you could see the grief on his face. He said, she doesn't want to eat. She doesn't want to go to school. She's obsessed with this idea that she has to choose her gender identity. And by the way, they gave this little girl, 11 years old, 26 different identities to choose from. I mean, this is madness. This is total madness. And I asked him, I said, well, why did you give her access to this? And he said, well, she had to have a computer to do schoolwork during COVID. The point is simply this, that social media is overwhelming our capacities to, it's ending childhood. It's overwhelming our capacities to set childhood aside as a time for people to grow up in and mature and learn how to deal with the world. And we could say the same thing about pornography too via social media. I don't know how I would have made it as a kid if in a world that now every child has to grow up in, when the most appalling things and extreme things from the adult world are easily accessible through the internet and social media.
Thank you. Anyone you like to add something?
Well, I just had a thought that with the question around is social media essentially a force for good or a force for social chaos? Typically, if you look at the invention of any technology throughout human history, any tool essentially, tools are actually, or they tend to be neutral. They can be used for good or they can be used for bad. And this is the case for most communications technology as well in the past. The printing press, it could be used for good, it can be used for bad, same with the radio, indeed for TV. But I think with social media, there's a very different, and I wouldn't make the same argument for social media because it's not just a tool that you own, you can do what you want with. It is always actually still in the hands of the people who have built it. And we need to remember that when we are on social media, for the most part, social media is free. And there's a reason why it's free. Two reasons. One is that the Silicon Valley had this ethic of things should be free, but they also have a value around entrepreneurship. So how do they make the money? And the sweet spot there is advertising. And to advertise properly, you need data. And so these people, these social media platforms, we call them social media because that's actually the phrase that's appealing. It's the advertising for what it is. What they really are, according to people like Jaron Lanier, they're attention manipulation empires, essentially. They're there to manipulate our attention in order to drive us into profitability for the people who own it. And what they've found is it's much cheaper and indeed quicker to manipulate people into negative emotions than it is into positive ones. To breed trust takes time, but to breed animosity and hatred and dislike is very quick. And we can see this through the algorithms, how it drives us to more extreme views and so on. So typically I'd say tools we invent as human beings, you know, a hammer, a sword, the printing press, it's hard to draw a value judgment on them. They're just tools. They can be used and abused expediently by people, depending on their agenda. And indeed, even religious texts can be the same, of course. Religious texts can do a great deal of good. They can also be used and abused expediently. But social media, I think, is always being used and abused expediently because at the end of the day, people are trying to make a profit without charging us any money. And we need to remember with social media, we are not the consumer, we are the product. And that's the big difference.
Pertaining to what Rod said about the possibility to choose between
26.
26. It developed in the past few seconds from 22 to 26, or?
Yeah, by the time people see this, it'll be 52.
Yeah. Then welcome to the European Union, because the European Parliament just declared a few weeks ago that the whole territory of the European Union is a official gender freedom zone. That's the official status of the European Union nowadays. But back to reality or normality, or to real questions. I think so to say that internet or social media will bring true democracy is a fake news. I totally agree with Dr. Nicholson that those platforms or those things are just tools which can be used for bad or good. But I think the question is, what were the expectations related to, for example, to the internet revolution, or to the web 2.0 revolution, or to this whole social media revolution? And I think the so-called traditional wisdom or wishful thinking was decades ago, was that internet will bring true democracy, real media pluralism, as there will be no more barriers, for example, related to printed press, but there will be the opportunity for everyone to launch his or her personal blog, web page, and there will be numerous reliable online news sources. And it turned out that in reality, the market mechanisms, the market structure related to press, to media, remain the same. So still there are large, big companies dominating the online media spectrum and existing as gatekeepers in the world of information. As there is the gatekeeper function of the old media companies decades ago. And of course, 10 years or a decade ago, there was a wishful thinking again pertaining to social media. Then this social media will bring true democracy, real democracy, the pluralism of opinions, etc., because everyone will be able to communicate and disseminate his or her own views on every different topic related to public issues on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. Because it will be free, there will be no editorial boards to decide on whether an opinion is valuable or not. And it turned out that still there is a gatekeeper, there is the platform, the social media platform, deciding on what is politically correct and what is politically incorrect. It's called Facebook policies. Yeah, Facebook policies. And instead of media pluralism and instead of the colorness or diversity of information, it turned out that those social media platforms generate opinion bubbles in which we live in. So, of course, there is the theoretical possibility that I will be able to get as much information as I want or I would like to, but there is a very high percentage of possibility that I will read news that I would like to read. I will get advertisements that are part of my interests. Or my cultural background, etc. So I think saying that internet or social media and democracy together will change the world for the better, I think it's a fake news. At least the traditional wisdom related to this whole internet and social media revolution was a fake news.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think it's also an important distinction between using social media and, well, living on social media. Many of us are doing both things, actually. But it's one thing if you promote your business, you promote yourself, a political party or whatever. But most people are just, living in social media. We are being sold things, we are being given information. And even though social media is great for self-organization, for organizing demonstrations, we have seen this many examples all over the world in the last 10 years. But in the West and the developed countries, I think the social media can also be an obstacle because it gives the possibility to many people to have the feeling that they are doing something without actually doing something. So you can say that you will maybe attend a demonstration. It means that you will definitely not attend that demonstration. And there's also a difference between between the driving forces. Like, for example, a friend of mine who is not really into politics, she pointed out once that in 2006, in Hungary, where there were mass demonstrations against the government and there was police brutality against the people, then the people just poured into the streets spontaneously. But these days, even the biggest anti-government demonstrations are like, well, let's announce a demonstration for next Sunday. Can you go there? Or you should go to holiday or to the Lake Balaton or something else. So I think that it's a completely different attitude behind it.
Well, if I can jump in for a second. What Calum said about social media is a tool, but it's not simply a neutral thing. It changes our consciousness. It changes the way we relate to the world, and the idea that it fragments our attention and makes us much more reliant on emotivism, on emotion, than reason. I think in that sense, it's a destructive force. When I was in Poland a couple of years ago doing research, I talked to a Polish high school teacher who said that there is no institution in this country, not the state, not the church, not the family, that has more influence on the young than social media. Well, that to me is pretty frightening because while I'm certainly in favor of freedom and open discourse, the idea that there is no way to control the way your children think, the things they think about, is pretty scary. Whether it's from this 11-year-old being colonized by this insane meme of gender, or as a case that I know of from back in the US with one of my son's friends, they became radicalized to white supremacy via social media because they took the normal anxieties that teenagers have, and some pretty nasty people from the far right took advantage of that. And I think that the fact that social media can be so individualistic, it's not shared in the commons, it can be very individualistic, and it preys on the emotion, makes me really worried about it. Final point, in China recently, like last week I believe it was, the Chinese government banned from social media LGBT groups, activist groups. I suspect they're doing that because they want to protect the kids. They can look at the West and see what's happening with the psychological meltdown of so many young people under the influence of gender ideology, and they want to protect their country from that. I would say that's a socially positive thing. But if we look at America, you're starting to see the social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, start to ban people who agree with me politically. Well, what the whole argument over social media comes down to is, what is good and what is democracy? How can we rule ourselves? How should we rule ourselves? And what it ultimately comes down to is that we don't agree on some pretty fundamental things, on disagreements that would have been moderated through the slowness of traditional media and traditional discourse. Now it's all instant, and that makes it almost impossible to use reason to grapple with and to work our differences out.
I do agree with Rod as well that those platforms are just tools, but those platforms are not neutral. The problem is that it also turned out that Silicon Valley and the algorithms do have ideology, and that's the problem. Although they advertise themselves as neutral, politically neutral platforms, but it's very, very clear that their Facebook policies are ideologically motivated. So they do have a clear preference of political values, which they would like to hide, of course, and communicate that we are very open, we are neutral, and we are open to all kind of different argumentations. But in reality, from time to time, let it be the migration crisis, gender issues, etc., it turns out that if I'm against mass migration, if I'm for the family and for sexes, for male and female, that it's hate speech, and then it's banned from in the name of neutrality, and in the name of democracy, it's banned from those platforms.
I just had two thoughts. One on Mariann's comment about protests and how they've changed. I remember a great article by the late English writer A.A. Gill from about 10, 11 years ago. And I think there was a protest somewhere in London outside some embassy, possibly the Israeli embassy. And it made the news that there was this vast protest. But he went to the protest. And he said, actually, there was one protester, and there were about 50 people with a soy latte photographing themselves watching the protest. And it really shows that often in the age of social media, people's need to perform their, the phrase fear of missing out, they perform their presence at an exciting event is often the priority rather than actual engagement with the real issues involved. Second thing I say is that Rod mentioned about how social media is changing our relationship to the world. And I think this really links back to the papers in the Hungarian Conservative, because they were looking at one of the core themes running through the papers was the shift from the power of censorship being vested in the state to increasingly now being invested in corporations. But the significant thing there is our relationship to these two things is very different. I mean, our relationship to the state has always been as a citizen, and it's something that has evolved organically over many centuries. We've fought wars over our relationship to the state. But what's happened in the last few decades is that corporations have emerged that fashion us not as citizens but as consumers. It's not evolved as invented. It's not organic, it's mechanical. It's asserted these are the rules now, and we don't always even know the rules. We just sign, we sign up and don't read the small print. And it's a very different relationship of being a citizen and a consumer. And it's something that I think we're struggling to deal with in society, simply because when you talk about, in the States, for instance, freedom of speech is not really about our relationship to each other. It's about our relationship to the state. The point of freedom of speech is that the state cannot silence us. But actually, the corporation's relationship to freedom of speech is not saying they can or can't silence ours. They can silence ours. It's, again, the corporation's relationship to the state. It's the state not imposing things on the corporation. And so there are a lot of interesting tensions that have evolved as our public square has been taken virtually. Because suddenly, when it's taken virtually, it cannot simply exist in a sense as we are in this room of having a discussion. The room itself would be constructed by a silicon architect in Silicon Valley. It'll be, we require the tool, which again, because we do not pay for it, is owned by someone else. We never own the tool. We are the product. We are the thing that's being hammered. We're not the person using the hammer. And I think that's the important thing to recognize about our relationship that Rod was saying between ourselves and the world, and our relationship through social media and how it's changing.
And in my work in the past couple of years has had to do with the emergence of what I call soft totalitarianism. The alarm was first sounded for me back in the US 5 or 6 years ago when I began to talk to people who had immigrated to America to escape communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And they were starting to say that things we see happening in America today remind us of what we left behind. And it sounded crazy to most Americans. We think of totalitarianism as Stalin, as the gulags, the secret police. We have none of that. So how can this be totalitarian? What they're talking about is the sort of thing Calum was just mentioning, how the state will, at least in the United States, the state will never tell you what you can and can't say. We have strong constitutional protections for that. But these corporations upon which we depend for these virtual spaces, they are very quick to censor on the side of wokeness, of progressivism. And via social media, there is such a thing as cancel culture that even though the state will never tell you you can't say that, if you say something that offends the social media mob, then you will very quickly find yourself denounced, besieged. There will be calls for your firing, and you will become an unperson. Very quickly. It can happen overnight. This is the sort of thing that people who lived through communism were saying they were watching happen in real time. I don't think that our constitutional, our liberal, in the sense of classically liberal, our classically liberal constitution and ways of thinking about the relationship of the individual to the state and to the wider society, we're going to have to rethink that a lot in the age of social media, because there's no doubt about it that the social media age is bringing about an age of repression, and repression from the side of the woke, of the left. The woke, the radical progressives, have now gained control, in the United States at least, of all the major institutions in society, media, academia, sports, big business most significantly, and even the CIA and the US military, as we've seen of late. The only force capable of defending freedom of expression, as I see it, is the state, which is a weird thing for an American conservative to say, certainly one who was formed in the age of Reagan. But the state is the only thing standing between us and this soft totalitarianism from Google, Facebook, Amazon, and the others. Have I depressed you?
No.
Because I've depressed myself.
But I'm also pessimistic related to these issues. The situation is more or less similar in Europe or in the European Union as well. Just to give you an example, this neo-Marxist liberal wave or tide influences, of course, not only those big tech firms, but also state legislation and also the jurisdiction of the European Union. Just to give you one very recent example, just yesterday the European Commission launched an so-called infringement procedure, an attack, political attack, against the Hungarian law on children protection. And they say that banning LGBTQAY plus
There are 52.
Yeah. That's the plus 4. To ban such kind of propaganda in schools and in kindergartens is against the right of the child to get and disseminate information. So that's the new saying, that although there is the real value to protect our children against negative impressions, for example, sexual content, homosexual content, gender propaganda, etc., they say officially that this intention, this conservative approach, goes against the right of the children to get as much information as he or she needs. And I think this is just one example that this whole insanity, at least in the continent, here in Europe, influences not only the big tech companies, Facebook, etc., but also the political and legal actions of the official European Union bodies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's safe to conclude that social media is changing our societies, because there's a lot of examples here which you mentioned with the Slovenian girl, but other examples as well. So it's safe to say that our societies are changing because of social media. And there's a lot of research is done about that, how, for example, a post, how many likes it gets, it changes our perception of that post. So it could be something really important, but if it says 5 likes, we don't think it's really that important. And you can see something which is less important but has like thousands of likes, it's perceived as much more important. It's also changing our brain, and I think that poor Slovenian girl you mentioned is a good example of how it's changing teenagers' self-esteem, the number of likes it gets. So I will try to stay on this topic a bit more, because I really liked what, for example, Miklós wrote in his article for Hungarian Conservative, that social media is, I think you said, the globalization made manifest. I really like that example because it's a huge force for globalization, social media. I mean, the opportunity that somebody in Brasilia or Nigeria or Vietnam can join the same Facebook groups and get the same information on the same platform is to some extent fantastic, but also kind of frightful as well. But I also liked, we talked with Calum about social media, and I think you wrote that social media helps us to narrate to others, but you're not sure if it helps us to relate to others. I think that's a very important distinction to make. So I would kindly ask you to think about how is social media changing our societies now, and perhaps Calum could start on that.
Well, actually, yeah, and it actually links to something that Rod was saying before about cancel culture, that the phrase cancel culture is essentially a new word we're using for an old idea. And once we call it what it's really called, we understand what we're looking at, which is ostracism. That's what we're looking at, social ostracism. Social ostracism is a thing that happens across all societies in various capacities, but in a lot of smaller sort of quote-unquote traditional societies. I say, speaking as an anthropologist, when I read anthropology at university, we'd hear about these the people who would be tarred and feathered and thrown out into the wood for some reason and ostracized from their community. And what's interesting, if you think about what society does, is that we particularly in sort of advanced, complex societies, it becomes untenable to constantly be doing that to people. I mean, we still do it to people, but this sort of social ostracism, not jailing, not when they've violated a law per se, but where they've just broken a social convention and we push them out into the woods. That's something that in a society we tend to develop ways of dealing with each other that transcend that. But what's really interesting, if you look throughout human history, at every point where we've invented a new communications technology, it could be writing, it could be the printing press, it could be the radio, it could be TV and so on. Every time it kind of changes how we relate to each other. And because it changes the narratives we tell to each other and how we tell them. And it's almost like we are reset to default settings. We have to relearn how to be people in society. And so it's interesting, whenever this happens, we have new waves of social ostracism. And you can see this when the radio was invented. The invention of radio was very powerful in the spreading of fascist ideas in Germany. The Nazis actually gave radios to everyone. Obviously that led to the brainwashing of the communities. But in the same way that with social media now, we are having, we call it cancel culture, but really it's social ostracism. We're saying this person is beyond the pale, we'll kick them out in the wood, their friends won't speak to them, their employer won't employ them. And that's what we're really talking about. And I think what's happening in all this is that if you think about our lives, we really have two things. We have narrations and relations. We tell stories and we tell stories to people. And the two sometimes can be in harmony and often they can be in conflict. Where we narrate, sometimes we fail to relate. If I decide that you and I have a different religion or something, or some different football team, you know, or anything, you know, we can decide we're not going to be friends now. We can't find empathy over that gap. And I think what's happening with social media is that it's a great space for narrating to others, to performing one's idea. And this is why often people are on social media. If you look at their Twitter handle, they'll give all of their labels. You know, I am, you know, a Remainer or a Leaver or whatever the category is. And they have all these identities, these labels, these narratives. And what that leads to is communication of narrative, but not connection between people. And part of it is the basic thing that empathy is in interpersonal contract, is meeting in person. Kids learn empathy slowly. Kids are mean. You know, remember when you're in school, we're all kind of mean as kids, but we learn not to be through seeing hurt other people. If we're not sociopaths anyway, we slowly learn, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I'll moderate what I said. On social media, you can leave a mean tweet. You never see the person crying at the other end of the screen. So it's a very different culture. And I think that I think what we're going to have to do as a society is relearn how to relate to one another. And I don't think that's necessarily a legislative solution, but it is a cultural shift of what is acceptable. And that'll come, but whether it comes in a few years or as what happened, you know, after the invention of the printing press, you almost had 200 years of instability in Europe after that. So how long it's going to be, who knows? I mean, certainly the changes happen very fast now. Whether our reaction to that is as fast as, I mean, it may be, but then again, it may not be.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add anything, or?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's very important to point out that how our young people, teen people, are related to social media, because there were several generations now who are already using Facebook. Our parents, grandparents, and well, many of them, of course, well, maybe they're just wasting their time on Facebook, or you know. Sharing their breakfast or something, or finding old classmates. But this is something which is more or less not really dangerous towards them. But for young people, I think that the danger can be, as you said also, is that they think that they are finding a community on Twitter, for example, because whatever crazy idea comes to their minds or whatever identity they come up with, they can always find the people who will encourage it and say that, yes, this is good, do it, do even more, go even further. There will always be people like this, and many of these people will not be fellow teenagers, but people hiding behind this image of other teenagers, you know, encouraging young people to do things that they would, well, normally not do in the regular communities. And this is also dangerous because they can find encouragement, but the same people and, well, let's say the same faceless profiles can just ditch them, can just cancel them in a second. And to cope with that, this can be pretty hard, I think.
I was in Prague earlier this week and had a couple of thoughts about social media and how it has changed the experience of the world. And my son and I were staying in a beautiful old hotel right in one of the famous squares there. And in the old days, which is to say 20 years ago, when you would have gone to a hotel, they would have had advice there for the things you should see in the city, the places of historical interest, the castles, the churches, etc. Now the hotel was promoting their balcony high up on the top floor as the best Instagram spot. It was incredible. That was their entire appeal of this hotel and its lobby. Come stay here or pay money to go up and Instagram yourself with this great view. And I've observed this in talking to children, the adult children of my friends. Whenever they travel, it's like the whole point of travel is for the Instagram shot that show them in some glamorous place. And people don't seem to see, they're being trained not to see the world as it is, but rather to position themselves in the world, the whole world as a set, sort of a movie set. Secondly, I was thinking, being in Prague, about Milan Kundera's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. There's a conflict in the novel between two characters. This one from Western Europe, Franz, believes that one can only be authentically human when one is completely transparent to the world, because only then can you live in truth. His girlfriend, Sabina, who comes from Czechoslovakia, as it was known then, believes that the only way one can be authentically oneself is to have a barrier between oneself and the world. Only when you know there are no eyes on you can you live in truth. Well, this is directly applicable, I think, to the dilemma we're facing now with social media and the internet. If you approach life only as a way to construct your own personality for the public, then you can't help but be inauthentic, it seems to me, because you're not really wondering, what do I really think or what should I think? But you're saying, how can I present myself to the world to get the most number of likes? So you would end up going to a place like Prague, and instead of seeing it as an opportunity to interact with a very different world, an old world, a different culture, rather you see the whole thing on the surface, only as a place to show to your friends back home that, look, I've been in Prague. What does that do to you as a person? And what sort of opportunities to grow and to change as a person do you rob from yourself by treating life as only a series of Instagram posts?
As a good conservative, I'm also very pessimistic about technological development. And not only with social media, but with this whole smart home, smartphones, etc. Of course, we are as well part of this new virtual or digital reality. But I think, and I feel it on myself, or with myself, or in my own life as well, that it over accelerates our life. And that's true not only for children, but for everyone, I think, that we cannot live the moment, or we cannot live in the moment, because our only goal is to make an Insta photo at the top of the building, but we are not there.
Right.
Maybe virtually we will be there if we will post the content on Instagram or Facebook, but in reality our soul or our mind is not in Prague. Right. In this case, and that's that's a personal issue, I think, how we'll raise our children, how to relate to smart tools and to this whole social media thing, because it's very obvious that although, for example, at least our generation was maybe the last one raising up without those smart tools and this whole internet revolution. I remember it was 2000 when internet connection was made for the first time at our home, but our children, they will. This will be their world. They will be raised next to those smartphones and tablets, because we use those tablets and smartphones, and it's our responsibility. It's a very conservative thing, I think, to say that this is the real responsibility of the individual, of the parents, how they will show them and teach them to use in a real smart way smart tools.
Yes, I agree, and actually it's interesting what you were saying about internet connection, because I remember I think it was 1999 when we had the first, and it was a dial-up.
Yeah.
Still, so it was still really slow, and you couldn't really use it for anything. I mean, you could perhaps open a few articles, and that's all. And in 20 years now, you have it on everything basically, and it's 4G, 5G. So the change is really amazing.
Over-accelerated.
And yes, and kind of shocking. Yes.
Well, I want to add to what Miklós was saying. If you talk to high school high school teachers and college professors in America today, they will tell you that the change in the mental health they've seen in their children and their students has been phenomenal just in the past decade or so. And this has actually been studied, that around 2012, 2013, there became a marked difference and decline in the mental health and emotional well-being of young people. Why that year? Because that was 4 or 5 years after the advent of smartphones. The iPhone came out in 2007. And so this is the first generation, the ones who are in their 20s today and teenagers today, the first generation raised with this as a social reality. And I talked to one teacher who told me, I'll never forget this. She said, it used to be that we would have students come into my office and have an emotional meltdown maybe twice every semester. Now, she said, it happens 2 or 3 times a week. There's something going on here. And it's all well and good, and I agree with you, Miklós, to say that parents have to take responsibility for their children. I bang on this topic all the time. But ultimately, we all live in a society when most parents either cannot or will not do that, and yet we have to live here. We are affected by the emotional breakdown of society and psychological breakdown. We are going to live in a world in which people raised in this culture, whose minds have been formed by this, will ultimately rise to positions of power within industry, within government, and other institutions. What's going to happen then?
Yeah, I also agree that it's very, very frightening, because I think that young people on the internet and social media get the absolutely wrong kind of encouragement. And if you look at the profiles, everyone has or thinks that they have depression, anxiety. Everyone has anxiety, and they are rewarding each other for it. So the more difficulties you have, the more mental problems you have, basically the cooler you are. And if someone is normal, I mean, even if we can still use this word,
maybe,
maybe. So
in Hungary we can still.
Yeah. So maybe if someone lives a normal, healthy life and they don't think that they are depressed, and they are doing sports and they have friends and value their family, then they are being called a ableist or extreme right, far right, fascism, all these kind of things. Yeah,
but they say, of course, nowadays that IT skills are and will be the most important knowledge for the new generation. But maybe, and that's related to this personal responsibility issue of the parents, but maybe from the point of view of mental health or intellectual capabilities, maybe the advantage will be for this new generation the ability to live without smartphones, maybe just for a few hours, just for a few days. Maybe this will be a mental and intellectual advantage, because 99% of the society will be literally attached to these tools. But maybe then the exception and the advantage will be that there will be few ones who will be able to live outside this virtual reality, maybe just for a few hours. Maybe they will be able not to touch their smartphones for a weekend if they are with the family on a vacation, but maybe this will be the real advantage.
In a land of the blind, the one-eyed man is...
Yeah.
I think one of the issues with the economic system we have today is it sees everything as a means to an economic end and nothing as an end in itself. So human life never as an end in itself, being a citizen not as an end in itself, but always a means to an end of being a consumer or producer or whatever it may be. And one of the dilemmas is that we think, we hear this language a lot, which you cited, that you've heard too, that people say, the skills the new generation need. but often it's at the expense and the cost of the skills that human beings have always needed to avoid things far more important than losing a job, which is actually fighting a war or having community conflict or whatever it is, which is again the skills of empathy, the skills of relating. And one of the things that I think, linking back to what you were all saying, and particularly about being in Prague and on the roof, is that I remember as a kid, the main thing I had to learn to deal with was boredom. I lived in a log house in the woods in the middle of Canada, and I had a lot of time to myself, and it meant with my time, I was never bored, but I had to find ways to stop myself being bored. I'd read, I'd draw, I'd write something, I'd talk about things or whatever it is, or I'd go for a walk in the woods. I'd do something with my time because there wasn't a distraction easily to hand. And one of the fundamental human skills, I think, is to develop that capacity to sit with yourself. And it's important for relationships too. I mean, if you think about what therapy is, for instance, we often hear therapy described as a talking therapies, psychotherapy. It's not actually, it's a listening therapy, because the real value is having someone listen to you attentively without judgment. And that's a skill, that's why we pay people to do it, because very few of us are actually very good at listening to people in a way where we're concentrating, but also empathetic. And so we actually have to professionalize this basic human skill, because that's all it is. A psychotherapist doesn't have any special insight, but they're very good at listening to you in a way that makes you make the connections that you wanted to make, for instance. And I think that these sorts of skills, we develop them through sitting with people. It's through listening to people, developing that skill, not just to talk, but to listen. And social media and the entire economy we are in, social media incentivizes talking, not listening, but the economic system we have incentivizes action, not stasis. The idea that time is money presumes that any wasted time is wasted money. It presumes the only way to measure the value of time is money. But actually there's a lot in our lives, indeed all the things that I think are probably most important to us in our lives, are that time is actually, the relations with other people. And you're not going to have many friends if you never give anyone a word in edgeways, if you never give anyone any time. And in the culture where people go to the hotel and the most important thing is, how do I fill my time with something exciting and perform it online? I get the Instagram picture on the roof. When that's the way we think, we're not developing those skills of actually getting to Prague and saying, what is this place? Let me go out and find out what people, let me take an interest in other people and what they're doing here. And let's go, look around the community, let's watch what people are doing in the street. But now it's all about me. I go to the roof, I take the picture for the people who aren't even here. So I think it's kind of an economic thing in the sort of neoliberal economy we live in, is the idea for me that nothing is an end in itself. Everything is a means to an economic end. And that is colonizing our attention, it's colonizing our psychology, it's reframing our relationships.
Well, there's a fantastic book that came out a few years ago called The Attention Merchants by Tim Wu. He's a scholar at Columbia University in the US. And it's a history of advertising in the era of mass media, starting in the late 19th century up till now. And he describes it sounds kind of boring to me, a history of advertising, but he actually describes it as a competition, a sort of an arms race in order to gain the attention of the audience. And he says that they've become better and better, advertisers have, at grabbing the attention of the audience. But he said we've reached a point now in the internet and social media era where corporations have neuroscientists working on ways to manipulate us and to grab our attention quickly before we can even mount a defense against it. And he says it's to the point where it really does question what it means to be human, a human person. And this is because of the way technology has been driven by the imperative, the consumerist imperative, but also the imperative to capture attention. He ends the book by talking about what a great thing it was. The medieval monks, the Benedictine monks, they knew that you are what you think about, and that they developed these techniques and disciplines for focusing one's attention. And Tim Wu, I presume, is not not necessarily a religious person, certainly not a medieval traditionalist. He says that we ought to look to them as these monks as a way of regaining our humanity, because they know the importance of focusing one's attention.
I think it's an interesting point, and especially with the whole digitalization and the internet, because our attention spans are shortening. I mean, basically you can And I think it's going to be even more important for the next generations because they have the tablet on their hands and they can just skip videos, skip articles. So it's the attention span of an average person is going to be far shorter. So I think that's also a challenge to advertising companies in the future.
Yeah, and think about this too. You know, why is it in the age of social media you have an astonishing number of young people reporting loneliness, that they have few friends? This is one thing I discovered in my research for my last book, that loneliness, as Hannah Arendt said, used to be a pretty rare thing in society, only reserved for people living in marginal conditions like old age. Now it is something that is experienced in a widespread way across society. Nobody is more lonely, according to social scientists, than members of Generation Z, the youngest people. They've grown up in an era of social media where they have all these connections. Why then are they lonely? Hannah Arendt has said in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that the number one, by far, most important factor that led to totalitarianism in Germany and Russia was mass loneliness. So this mass loneliness we are creating through social media is going to have ultimately, I believe, a very significant political effect.
Just linking actually 2 points that Mariann and yourself just made about or taking the topic of loneliness. I think there's two types of loneliness really that we see through social media. One is the loneliness of, well, I had an example recently. I was in a cafe just after the end of lockdown. Cafes opened in England, and I went into this cafe and I was sitting there, and these four lads walked in. And you could see they hadn't seen each other for 18 months. They were like, "Oh, it's great to see you, it's great to see you." And they were all laughing, and they all sat down at the table and went, and they all pulled out their phones. And then all four of them were on their phones, and they weren't communicating. And so there's the loneliness of being an addict, essentially, because that's what we are when we spend all our times. Everyone in this room probably is to some extent a bit of a smartphone addict. We all find ourselves in moments when a conversation pauses, reaching for the pocket with the phone. Oh no, I should leave it. And that's, it's turning us all into addicts. It's designed to be. The second sort of loneliness is something I think Mariann mentioned earlier, which is when you have these, often kids, but people in general, forming these communities around, in all good faith, they're forming communities around whatever issue they may be having. It may be the trans issue, it may be autism, or it may be depression, whatever it is, whatever one's sense of vulnerability is, that then you find online, you have a great sense of relief. When you find people, you think, "Oh, I'm not alone. I'm also part of. There's other people who are having the same difficulties I am." And the problem is, though, with a lot of those groups, as soon as it becomes an identity, it ceases to simply be a support group. Because suddenly, if you realize that, as with any type of human community, there start to be rules, there starts to be a hierarchy, prescribed language of way you talk in that group to be an insider. Suddenly you feel down here, you feel a sense of conditionality, and you think, if I leave, will I be an apostate? Will I be kicked out into the woods? And this is often what's happening. If you look at a lot of these movements, the people the worst sort of attacks are not actually held for people one disagrees with. It's people one thought one agreed with who then leaves the group. So if you look at a lot of people getting cancelled, they're actually rarely conservatives, actually. They're often people who are actually quite liberal. Take J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling was a bastion of progressive thought, and still is, I'd argue. She's absolutely persona non grata now in sort of, right-thinking, often left-thinking communities because of her views on women's rights and trans issues. And so she's been sort of ostracized. Now, there are many people who share the same view of her who never were held up as a member of the community, but those people aren't being cancelled because no one expected them to be. So I think that there are these two sorts of loneliness. You have the loneliness of the addiction, of being addicts with social media, but there's also the loneliness of the fear of ostracism, which I think is what you were getting at, which is something that all communities have to some extent, but social media is supersizing that problem. And really, I've always felt that in the same way airplanes have been a great vector for biological contagion, social media is a very powerful vector for ideological contagion. And so what we're seeing is the spread of viral ideas across society, and we're not inoculated against it.
I think this loneliness issue is due to the fact that we are confused what is real reality and what is digital reality or pseudo reality. And some people, or sometimes all of the people think that this digital reality is the real life, because there are things happening, because there I see my friends, there I communicate with my family, etc. This home office thing became very popular in the past few months, a year, during the pandemic. We communicate with our colleagues via the internet, via social media platforms, etc. So the barriers between digital reality and normal reality became so vague for nowadays that it confuses people. And when it turns out that digital reality is a virtual reality and there are no real physical friends and there are no real physical colleagues there, because it's the Facebook, not the office where I work, then they feel loneliness.
Interesting. And I think this turns us to the issue of regulation, because all these social changes and the protection of children will kind of demand from societies or the state to somehow regulate social media. Of course, we can already see that the social media companies are trying to regulate themselves. The most infamous case is the Facebook Oversight Board. But our perception as conservatives is that this regulation is actually censoring ideas which they don't like, ideologies which they don't really support. Perhaps the most shocking example was the banning of Donald Trump, the democratically elected president of the United States, which was for me kind of shocking, because this is a democratically elected leader who you are banning from a really important part of our society. And of course, double measures. I mean, for example, the Iranian prime minister was never banned on social media. And of course, I mean, you can say what you would like about Trump, but I don't think he's the same category as the Iranian prime minister, let's say. So what can we do? Is because these companies are always claiming that, of course, they are private companies. This is not a public good. So if you don't like Facebook, you don't like Twitter, you can always just delete yourself from it and you don't have to participate. Which, of course, is to some extent true, but is it really a valid claim? Because you could also say that it is a public good. It's something which is, if you're not on Facebook or you're not on Twitter, you're missing out on parts of our society. So what should we do as conservatives, but also as people who are concerned with what's going on social media? How could we regulate social media? Should the state step in, or what should we do? Perhaps Miklós as a lawyer can start.
To tell the truth, I do not have a recipe for this, how to solve the problem. What is clear for me that this is a sovereignty issue. Who has the general power over the society? And this general power, of course, lays mostly, or in a great part, on how much do you know about your citizens. And here comes the question, because the new currency of our ages is information, personal data. And the point will come, the time will come, I think, in a few years or a decade, when it will be official that those big IT giants know much more, not only than the state about us, but as we about ourselves. And that is the problem to the data, because if you know every single habit, every single minute of the life of your citizens, of your consumers, then you are the sovereign. Of course, we are afraid, or we were afraid previously, of real dictatorships, totalitarian regimes, of communism, of Nazism, because one of their ultimate goal was to rule the everyday life of the people. And how were they able to rule the life of the everyday people? That they intended to get as much information as possible about their life, than to show them how to live. And And that is the problem with those IT giants and big tech firms, that they will have more data, more personal data, more sensitive data about the citizens, about the consumers than the state itself. But to tell the truth, until some kind of physical infrastructure is needed for internet connectivity, then the ultimate decision is still in the hands of the state, what to do. Of course, that's a very radical solution, and I do not advise for it in democracies, but theoretically, I'm just saying that to regulate social media is a very specific topic, of course, but if we have the broader horizon, what to do with this whole internet issue, at the end of the day, till there are physical infrastructures for internet connectivity, for communication companies, then the states still have some room for make some regulation, or at least to give intentions. For example, for IT communication companies, not big tech firms, Facebook, but like for those companies who own the wires, the cables, how to behave.
So at least it's a fail-safe if everything fails.
Yeah.
In the end.
Yeah, I also agree that it's certainly a matter of national security, and no wonder that China and Russia have their own social media platforms, because why would they hand over an incredible amount of valuable information about their own citizens to other countries?
Sadly, Miklós had to leave early. I would like to thank him for being here. We'll resume with other speakers.
So, of course, for smaller countries, it is not really a realistic possibility to make your own social media platform which can take the place of Facebook. And of course, we can tell people to delete yourself from a certain platform, but while you can easily delete yourself from TikTok, Twitter, or just avoid using them altogether. You really won't miss too much, but if you're not on Facebook, then you will actually be left out from many things, because all your friends are on Facebook. They are organizing events, and especially for young people, but also people our age, you can be left out of many things, and even there are businesses which are running on Facebook, or your workplace has a discussion group on Facebook, and it can be an actual disadvantage for you if you're not on that group. And the other problem is that the people who say that just delete yourself, they are, in favor of the big tech companies, which basically suffocate all other social media platforms, which are try to be censorship free, and they are labeling them that they are kind of far right conspiracy theories and these kind of things.
Yeah, it really is true that, I'm not on Facebook myself, but I found out recently that here in Hungary, Hungary's Facebook censorship board, or whatever it is, told a conservative magazine, Magyar, that they should not publish anything written by me because they said I'm dangerous. Well, that's, as a journalist, you're like, yeah, but the fact is, Magyar depends on Facebook to get its message out. In Romania, an independent journalist who depends on Facebook to do his work, Facebook kicked him off of the platform because he published an interview he did with me about my recent book. So, these are decisions made in the local country, but they had a tremendous economic effect on the guy in Romania who now can't do his work on Facebook and on Magyar. So this sort of thing makes me furious. But in the end, I wonder how can we regulate them in a free society, given that they are private enterprises. We could see, as Miklós was saying before he left, that we could see them as like public utilities, and put certain regulations on them, requiring them to have a certain amount of tolerance. But even if we didn't, let's say in Hungary, let's say the Hungarian government decided to put certain regulations on social media, how would that even be enforceable with the internet connected to every other country in the world? It seems to me the only alternative would be what China is doing, which strikes me as, at a minimum, extremely problematic. I may think it's wise for the Chinese to govern what transgenders say for the sake of protecting their young, but the Chinese government, of course, goes much, much farther than that. And and I do not want us to live in a digital dystopia such as China.
With regard to the question on regulation, I mean, I think the first most important thing to establish, what is the problem with trying to regulate? And I think with social media companies, there are essentially two problems. One is the issue we've been talking about of moderation, of how are the comments moderated and so on. That's one problem, and I think that can probably be dealt with legally, but I suspect that the legal guidance, or indeed the legal law that is needed, would be to say to them that they need to be explicit about what their rules are. I don't think it's a problem that a social media company is excluding particular political views, because in a sense they can do it either direction, that's their right. The issue is not making explicit that's what they're doing. Like, if you're going to be a very progressive ideological platform, then state that. State that, because then people know not to join. It's not their thing, and then the market will create a new platform for people who maybe have a different view. And I still think that sort of ideological siloing and different things is a problem. But at the very least, I think legally it's probably more likely you have to say, be explicit about what your rules are. Because I think the problem with Facebook at the moment is that their rules and the Justice Minister's article, I think Varga's article was actually talking about this, that it's ambiguous as to what the rules are. Facebook have this panel, but it's a bit sort of secretive as to what its criteria are of kicking someone off the platform. So there's a moderation issue, which I think may have a legal solution. The second issue is about manipulation. It's about the fact that the algorithms do manipulate our attention. They do direct us in particular directions. And this comes back to what these institutions are. We call them social media because that's what we like to call them, but really what they are attention manipulation empires, and they're profit-making companies, right? Obviously, but they don't make the profit from us paying for it. They make the money off selling our data to people. Again, we are the product, and Jaron Lanier has an interesting argument around this. He says the real solution is actually to start charging for search and charging for social media. He said the Netflix model, 20 years ago, people thought that no one would ever pay a subscription for Netflix for TV access to TV. People want free stuff, but actually Netflix and the streaming service model has shown that people will pay for content if it's valuable to them. And I think if we were all paying £3 a month for a Google search on a subscription, or we were paying a few pounds a month for Facebook. I mean, we are also integrated onto Facebook. Most people would still probably pay it. And that would take away, in theory, the need to actually manipulate us so much to drive us into forms of behavior which drive us to certain advertisers and certain products and so on. So I think there's maybe a legal solution and also an economic solution, which will largely come through people realizing what it is social media companies do, and then change in the same way with the social justice stuff. We can debate the value of some of these social justice movements over the last year, but one thing that's proven is that the power of public outrage can change institutions. Now, I think it's caused the institutions and the corporations to do very cynical things often, to say we champion rights while also, making things in China or whatever it may be. But I think that what it has proven in principle, that public ire can influence corporations to change their behavior. If there was enough of an outcry about the manipulation model, and people said we would be willing to pay a couple pounds a month instead of having our data sold, then maybe things can change. And I certainly think it's possible to do it. But the third thing I think that is necessary beyond legal remedies or economic incentives or changing the culture around what is acceptable economically is actually to change how we educate. Typically in the West, since the Enlightenment, education is about helping us produce knowledge, because we come from, people talk of the Dark Ages before the printing press. It's a problematic term, but essentially what you could argue is that prior to the printing press, and certainly later on the Enlightenment, people lived in a slightly underexposed picture of the world. If you're a photographer, you have an underexposed picture. an overexposed picture and a well-exposed picture. You could argue that there was less of a plurality of perspectives to draw on, so you just had the monolithic authority of say, the church to say this is the way it is, and then with the printing press you had a diversification of perspectives, and that led ultimately to the Enlightenment, an enlightened picture. I think the problem we're faced now, though, is not that we need to train people in how to produce knowledge and understand knowledge. It's now teaching them how to triage knowledge. The problem now is not underexposure to knowledge, it's overexposure. And as any photographer knows, over and underexposure actually amount to the same thing, which is an unclear picture of what we're looking at. So I say, the printing press led to the reformations, and I say the invention of the internet and social media is leading to the deformations. We're seeing across the culture all this deforming of the culture. And I think really the real solution to that is not a political devolution in some way, and it's not a knowledge revolution and more technology. I think it's an educational evolution, changing how we educate and why we educate. And I think it's really we need to train people to keep their self-possession, to keep their head when everyone about them is losing theirs, to maintain their self-possession in the face of these constant narratives that are trying to suck in their attention and create these new communities, which, as you're saying, are quite, give you a sense of being ostracized if you're not right on everything. So I think that there are some legal solutions. There's some shift needed in what we perceive as acceptable in terms of the what we're going to put up with as a society in terms of the economic logic of these technologies. And on that point, I should just note that another thing I've been thinking for a while is that the technology of neoliberalism is computing. I mean, neoliberalism started really in the 80s. It couldn't have happened without Excel spreadsheet and Microsoft. But the same way computing is the technology of neoliberalism, neoliberalism is the economics of computing. It is the economic system that computing generates. The two you can't separate them, I don't think. It's no coincidence that the sort of neoliberal sort of market fundamentalist view where everything is reduced to the market is happening at a time when people could actually gather and process and share the data through spreadsheets and software. You couldn't have done that with paper. So the two are very tied together, and so I think we need to change our view of the economic system around this and what we think is acceptable. But honestly, I think fundamentally we need to shift how we educate and why we educate, which I think is about time, because educational institutions right now feel a bit moribund. They feel a bit stale. If they feel very ideological. They've got away from critical thinking skills. And I do think what we need is not even critical thinking per se. What we need is intellectual due diligence. If you're a lawyer and if you're a company, you're buying another company, you check the contracts and check the accounts to make sure it is what they say it is. And I think we need people to be trained in intellectual due diligence to say, is this idea what I think it is? And to teach them the tools of that. And
I think it's important what you're saying, because it shows that we also have an individual responsibility with this.
Yeah.
And just an interesting example, because there was a research here in Hungary actually made by social scientists when they went to a cinema and offered free cinema tickets for people. And of course, everybody likes free things. So they went there and they handed over tons of personal data. You had to register in a fake website. They asked for a lot of personal data. Everybody gave it to them. And actually, if you clicked on the terms, it was asking them to please read our terms and conditions. And it was lorem ipsum, so it was nothing. But people clicked on it, didn't care, still okayed the whole thing. And they could, from these data, they could check all their social media sites. And in the end, they asked these people to come back for a fake interview. And they told them the deepest personal details, basically, which they offered them freely through these free cinema tickets. But things like that, we know that you're lactose intolerant. We know that your mother died half a year ago in cancer. So really deep personal details. And all of these people were really shocked that how do you know it? And they told them that because you gave us this information freely through kind of a bit stupid competition for free cinema tickets. And what was shocking in this research, that it wasn't, uneducated people who did it. It was everybody. So even university-educated people still didn't look at the terms and conditions, didn't care about giving over all these personal data for this really cheap things. And I think this shows that we also have an individual responsibility in these matters. So I think it's important what you were saying, but I think Rod still has something to...
Well, one thing that's interesting that you're saying this is that this happened in Hungary, a country that lived through 40 years of communism.
Yes.
Listening to you say that reminded me of something I heard from a woman named Kamila Bendova. Kamila and her husband Václav Benda were in the inner circle of Czech dissidents around Václav Havel. Her husband, who died in 1999, he went to prison for 4 years for his dissident activity. I was interviewing Camilla in their apartment in Prague a couple of years ago for my book about soft totalitarianism, and she started by telling me she has no idea why so many Americans give over all their data to companies, but she said that information really is power. She said that's how the communist state controlled us, by learning everything they could about us and using that information to threaten us, to force us to conform. She said people who think that giving over information is a neutral act are incredibly naive, and they'll come to regret it. And I agree with her in this age of Alexa and the websites and all that. But you're telling me that in a country that should know better, because the older generation went through communism, that the younger people don't even care.
Yes, I think that's also kind of frightening. Sadly, we're running out of time, so if you have any last comments you would like to make, please do it. But if not, I will, I will close there. I'm not sure if you have anything further to add. Well, thank you very much for being here. Mariann, Miklós, who said he had to leave a bit early, Rod, Calum. I think we had a really interesting discussion, and of course we could talk hours about several other aspects of social media. We didn't really actually talk that much about digital sovereignty, sadly, but perhaps next time we will have more time to talk about that as well. And I would also like to thank our viewers for joining in with us today, and hope to see you soon on one of our live events as well. Thank you.